It was not a country. It had no king, no crown, no people of its own. It was a business, a joint stock company with shareholders and a board of directors and an annual report. And at its peak, that business ruled 200 million human beings. 1 out of every 5 people alive on Earth answered, in the end, to a corporate office in London. It commanded a private army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the standing army of Britain itself. It printed its own money. It ran its own navy. It waged its own wars, signed its own treaties, and hanged its own prisoners. It conquered a subcontinent for profit, and then its accountants opened the books, found a hole deep enough to swallow the British treasury, and the most powerful company in the history of the world had to be seized by the government overnight before it dragged the empire down with it. This is the long fall of the East India Company. On the last day of the year 1600, a group of London merchants knelt before Queen Elizabeth I and asked for a piece of paper. The paper was a royal charter. It granted them, and no other Englishmen, the exclusive right to trade with everything east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. In practical terms, the Queen had just handed a few hundred investors a private monopoly on half the planet. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. The world would come to call them simply the company. In the beginning, it was almost modest. They wanted spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, the addictive luxuries that Europe paid silver for by the ton. They were latecomers. The Dutch and the Portuguese were already there, already armed, already killing for the trade. The first English fleets were small. The voyages took 2 years, and a startling number of the men who sailed never came back. But the arithmetic was irresistible. A single successful voyage could return its investors 200, 300, sometimes 500%. You could die, but if you lived, you came home rich enough that it didn't matter how. For its first 50 years, the company was a trading firm and nothing more. It built small fortified warehouses, factories they called them, on the edges of the Indian coast. Surat, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. These were not colonies. They were loading docks with walls. The company rented them, often from the local Indian rulers, who were vastly more powerful than a handful of damp Englishmen with a warehouse and a debt. The Mughal Empire, which ruled most of India, was at that moment the richest, most populous state on earth, producing perhaps a quarter of the entire world's economic output. The company was, to the Mughal court, a flea on the back of an elephant. Nobody in that court could have imagined the flea would one day own the elephant. The thing that changed the company, the thing that turned a trading firm into an empire, was almost an accident of corporate structure. The royal charter did not just grant a monopoly. Over the decades, successive monarchs, always desperate for the company's loans, kept adding powers to it. The right to acquire territory, the right to mint coinage, the right to command fortresses and troops, the right to form alliances, make war, and conclude peace with any non-Christian power, the right to exercise civil and criminal jurisdiction. A trading company had been quietly granted every single attribute of a sovereign state, except the name. It was a corporation with the legal power to declare war, and eventually it would use it. The opportunity came from the slow rotting of the empire it lived inside. Through the early 1700s, the Mughal Empire, that quarter of the world's economy, began to fracture. Provincial governors stopped sending tribute to the capital. Regional kingdoms broke away. The roads grew dangerous. The central army grew weak, and the great machine of Mughal India began, for its own internal reasons, to come apart. Into that vacuum, every armed faction in India poured. Persian invaders, Afghan raiders, the Marathas, the French, and a London trading company that had quietly built itself a private army to guard its warehouses. The company did not break India, but it was standing in the room, fully armed, holding a chartered license to wage war. When India broke, they were called sepoys. Indian soldiers trained and paid and disciplined in the European style, but fighting for a corporation. This was the company's secret weapon. And it was a strange one. The vast majority of the army that conquered India was Indian. The company never had more than a few thousand European troops in the entire subcontinent. It conquered India, in large part with Indian soldiers paid for with Indian taxes, fighting Indian rulers on behalf of London shareholders. It was the most efficient conquest in human history, precisely because the conquered population was being made to pay for and fight its own conquest. That is not an empire. That is a business model. If you want a single moment where the company stopped being a trading firm and became a government, it is a muddy afternoon in Bengal on the 23rd of June, 1757. The place was a mango grove called Plassey. On one side stood the army of the young ruler of Bengal, the richest province in India. 50,000 men wore elephants' French artillery. On the other stood a company force of around 3,000, most of them sepoys, commanded by a 32-year-old former clerk named Robert Clive. By every measure of numbers, it should have been a slaughter. The company should have been annihilated. Clive did not win the Battle of Plassey. He bought it. In the days before the battle, company agents secretly negotiated with the ruler's own commander, a man named Mir Jafar, and with the Hindu banking houses that financed the province. The deal was simple. When the cannon opened, Mir Jafar would hold back the largest part of the army and do nothing. In exchange, the company would make him the new ruler of Bengal, and he would pay them an almost unimaginable fortune for the favor. The battle, when it came, was less a battle than a performance. A monsoon shower wet the ruler's gunpowder. Mir Jafar's tens of thousands stood and watched. By evening, it was over. The richest province in India had changed hands in an afternoon, decided not by courage, but by a bribe. What followed Plassey is almost beyond the scale of an ordinary robbery. The company looted the treasury of Bengal. Boats, a long convoy of them, carried the seized treasure down the Hooghly River to the company's fort at Calcutta. The plunder of Bengal in those first years has been estimated, in modern terms, in the tens of billions of dollars. Robert Clive personally walked out of Bengal one of the richest self-made men in Europe. When Parliament later questioned him about it, he said famously that standing in a treasure vault open to him with gold and jewels on every side, he was, his words, astonished at his own moderation. He had taken a fortune. He considered himself restrained for not taking more. Here is where the story turns and where most people stop paying attention, because the next chapter is not a battle. It is an accounting problem. In 1765, the company took the final step. It forced the Mughal emperor, by then a figurehead, to grant it the Diwani of Bengal, the legal right to collect all taxes across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. 30 million people. A London corporation now held the taxing authority over a population larger than Britain's. It was no longer a company that traded in Bengal. It was the government of Bengal that happened to be a company. On paper, this was the greatest commercial coup in history. The company's shares soared. Its directors promised the shareholders rivers of revenue on paper. The reality was a catastrophe arriving in slow motion. The men running Bengal were not administrators. They were traders with guns, and they ran the richest province on earth the way you would strip a stolen car. They squeezed the tax revenue to the bone and beyond it. They monopolized internal trade so that Indian merchants could not compete. They extracted everything that could be extracted, sent the dividends home to London, and reinvested almost nothing. And then in 1770, the rains failed. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed, by the most cited estimates, around 10 million people, roughly a third of the population of the province. In the middle of mass starvation, the company did not lower taxes. In several districts, it raised them. Its agents continued to enforce collection. Its officials, in some cases, continued to corner the grain trade and profit from the scarcity that was killing the people they had been granted the right to govern. It is one of the most damning facts in the history of capitalism. The richest corporation on earth presided over the death of 10 million human beings and balanced its books across the corpses. And then, with grim and perfect irony, the famine destroyed the company too. The logic was simple and merciless. 10 million dead taxpayers do not pay taxes. The land revenue of Bengal, the entire foundation of the company's promised fortune, collapsed at the exact moment the company had borrowed enormous sums against the expectation of it. The directors in London had been paying out fat dividends year after year on profits that existed mostly on paper. The famine pulled the paper away. By 1772, the most powerful corporation in the history of the world was quietly running out of cash. In the summer of 1772, the books were opened and the whole was finally seen for what it was. The company that ruled 30 million people, that fielded an army twice the size of Britain's, that paid a dividend so reliable that its shares were the bedrock of half the fortunes in London, could not pay its debts. It owed money to the Bank of England. It owed money to private creditors across Europe. It owed back taxes to the British Crown itself. And it had in its vaults almost nothing. The company applied to the British government for an emergency loan, a bailout of £1.5 million. The largest corporation on earth had gone, in the modern phrase, cap in hand to the state. The collapse of the company would not have been an ordinary bankruptcy. Its shares were held by members of parliament, by lords, by the Bank of England, by the royal family itself. Its debt was woven into the entire London financial system at the very moment that system was already reeling from a separate banking panic. If the East India Company fell, it would not fall alone. It would take a significant slice of the British establishment down with it. In other words, it was too big to fail. The phrase did not exist yet, but the trap it describes was invented more or less right here. A private company so entangled with the state that the state could not afford to let it die, and so was forced to rescue the very thing that was looting it. Parliament granted the loan. But the British government, having now paid to save the company, was no longer willing to let it run a subcontinent unsupervised. In 1773 came the Regulating Act, the first time Parliament reached into the company and rearranged its insides. It created a Governor General of Bengal, appointed with the government's blessing, and a Supreme Court answerable to London. For the first time, the British state had put its hand on the wheel. The company was still in the driver's seat, but there was now a government agent in the passenger seat, and his hand was creeping toward the keys. What happened over the next 80 years was not a fall in the dramatic sense. It was a strangling, slow, deliberate, legislative, the British state, having decided the company was too dangerous to fail and too dangerous to trust, simply began taking it apart, one act of parliament at a time. In 1784, the India Act created a board of control in London government ministers who now oversaw the company's political decisions directly. The company kept its profits and its patronage. The government took its policy. The corporation that had conquered India was now being governed from London by the very state it had once loaned money to. Then they came for the business itself, the actual trading that the whole enterprise had been founded to do. In 1813, Parliament stripped the company of its monopoly on trade with India. In 1833, it stripped away the monopoly on trade with China, the lucrative tea and opium trade that had become its last great cash engine. And with that, the East India Company stopped being a company in any meaningful sense. It no longer traded. It no longer sold anything. It had become a strange, hollow thing. A private corporation that did no commerce at all and existed only to administer an empire of 200 million people on behalf of a government that had taken everything else away from it. By the 1850s, the East India Company was an administrative ghost. It ruled a fifth of humanity. It collected taxes from 300 million people. It commanded the largest army in Asia. And it answered increasingly to a board of control, a governor general appointed in London, and a parliament that regarded it less as a partner than as an embarrassment that had not yet been formally buried. All it would take to end it was a reason. In 1857, India gave the British Empire a reason no one could ignore. In the spring of 1857, the sepoys, the Indian soldiers who were the company's army, the army that had conquered India for it, turned their guns around. The spark was a new rifle cartridge, rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, an insult to the deepest faith of both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, but the cartridge was only the match. The fuel was a century of conquest, contempt, broken kings, seized lands, and a corporation that had governed a quarter of the world as a balance sheet. The rebellion, the great uprising of 1857, tore across northern India. Whole regiments mutinied. Cities fell, the fighting was savage on every side, the reprisals more savage still. It took the British more than a year and an enormous infusion of crown troops to crush it. And when the smoke cleared, the British government had finally seen enough. It was no longer acceptable, politically, morally, financially, that a private company should own a fifth of the human race. In 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act. With a stroke of the pen, the crown seized everything. The territories, the treasury, the courts, and the great sepoy army were all transferred to the British government. The Queen now ruled India directly. The East India Company, the most powerful corporation that has ever existed or perhaps ever will, was stripped of every function it had left. It was, in the end, nationalized, seized by the very state it had once been rich enough to lend money. The company itself was not even dramatically killed. It simply lingered, a corporate shell with no empire and no business, for a few more years, paid off, wound down, its stock redeemed by the government. In 1874, by an unremarkable act with an unremarkable name, the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act, the governor and company of merchants of London trading into the East Indies, was formally dissolved. There was no funeral, no headline. The greatest corporation in the history of the world ended not with a battle or a bankruptcy court, but with a routine piece of financial paperwork signed in a quiet office in London, 274 years after a few merchants knelt before a queen and asked for a piece of paper. They taught you in school about kings and empires and the wars between nations. They did not tell you that for 2.5 centuries, a fifth of every human being alive answered to a company. Not because it is a secret, but because it does not fit the story we like to tell, that empires are built by nations, that history is made by governments, that a corporation is just a thing that sells you goods. The East India Company was a corporation that conquered a subcontinent, killed millions, printed money, fielded armies, and very nearly became too big for the British state to control, until that state had to swallow it whole to survive it. It is the warning at the bottom of capitalism's story. A company is a tool for making money, and a tool that powerful, pointed at a continent, will use any means the money requires, and only a force greater than itself will ever make it stop. The flag is gone. The army is gone. The men who astonish themselves with their own moderation are dust. But the model they invented, the private power that grows beyond the reach of the state that created it, never quite went away. It just changed what it sells. Thank you for watching The Long Fall. If decline stories like this one interest you, the empires, the companies, the giants that fell, subscribe, and the channel will be here.